This is HOA meltdown moments. The complaint stack was identical, and that was the point. Do not walk away from me. Janice Mitchell slapped a bank statement on the table in front of me and screamed that the totals were correct because she said so. Her voice echoed across the mailbox cluster at the Reserve at Kingsbridge HOA in Burlington, Vermont, and 3 neighbors turned to stare. I stood there with my arms crossed, my green light jacket zipped up against the October chill, and watched her face turn red. She jabbed her finger at the paper and told me I owed $200 for a landscaping violation I had never been notified about, and if I did not pay by noon tomorrow, they would tow my vehicle. I am a telecom project coordinator who lives in spreadsheets and logs, and I know when numbers do not add up. The statement she waved around had a vendor payment on it that did not match anything in the budget packet I had saved from the annual meeting 6 months ago. I stared at her and asked her to show me the original notice. She said she did not have to prove anything to me. I moved to Burlington 2 years ago because the job paid well and the neighborhood looked quiet. The Reserve at Kingsbridge HOA runs a small development with about 60 townhomes, and the mailbox cluster is the unofficial courtroom where everyone hears about your business. Janice is the architectural committee chair, and she has been in that role for at least 4 years. She carries a clipboard everywhere she goes, wears a gray baseball cap most days, and keeps a handheld radio clipped to her belt like she is running dispatch for a police department. The first year I lived here, I never had a problem. I kept my lawn trimmed, I did not paint anything, and I stayed out of the group chat drama. But about 6 months ago, things started changing. Violations started appearing on doorsteps with no explanation, and the enforcement got aggressive. People whispered about a case from 3 years ago involving missing money and a contractor who got paid twice for the same job, but nobody wanted to talk about it on the record. I figured it was neighborhood gossip until Janice showed up at my door last week with a notice claiming I had an unapproved fence extension. I do not have a fence. She waved the clipboard at me now and told me the notice had been hand-delivered 2 weeks ago. I checked my doorbell camera footage and found nothing. I told her that, and she said the camera must have malfunctioned. I asked her who delivered it, and she said that was not my concern. She tapped her handheld radio and said she could call the tow company right now if I wanted to keep arguing. A rideshare driver sat in his car 20 feet away, waiting for a pickup, and he rolled his eyes. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA portal. I tried to upload a dispute, but the page failed to load. I refreshed it twice, and it timed out both times. Janice smiled and said the portal had been updated and I needed to submit disputes in person at the management office. I asked her when that policy changed, and she said it was in the last board email. I never got a board email. I told her I would go to the management office first thing in the morning. She said the office was only open from 9 to 11 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and tomorrow was Wednesday. I asked her why she was telling me I had until noon tomorrow if I could not file a dispute until Thursday. She said that was my problem. I felt my jaw tighten and I glanced at my watch. It was already 4 in the afternoon and the tow yard she kept threatening me with closed at 5. If they took my vehicle tonight, I could not recover it until the next business day, and I had a site audit tomorrow morning that I could not miss. I told her I would pay under protest and request a refund after I reviewed the records. She said refunds required board approval and the next meeting was not until December. I stared at her and realized she was not enforcing rules. She was running a shakedown. I paid her the $200 in cash because I did not have a choice, and she wrote me a receipt on a slip of paper torn from a notepad in her jacket pocket. No letterhead, no HOA logo, just her signature and the date. I took a picture of it with my phone and she asked me what I thought I was doing. I told her I keep records. She said I was being dramatic, and if I kept questioning her authority, she would make an example out of me so everyone learns. That phrase hit me like a slap. I had heard it before, 3 years ago, in a group chat screenshot someone had posted and then deleted. Back then, a neighbor named Derek had fought a bogus fine for an unapproved patio heater, and Janice had used the exact same words. Derek moved out 2 months later, and nobody knew why. I decided right then that I was not going to be Derek. Janice lifted her handheld radio and pressed the button. She said something about confirming a pickup location, but she did not give an address, and nobody responded. She clipped the radio back to her belt and told me to have a nice evening. She walked away, and I stood there holding my phone and the cash receipt. The rideshare driver finally picked up his passenger and drove off, shaking his head as he passed me. I went home and pulled up every document I had saved from the HOA since I moved in. Budget packets, meeting minutes, election results, vendor contracts. I spread them out on my kitchen table and started looking for the landscaping vendor Janice had mentioned. The name on her bank statement was Green Edge Property Services. I found 2 references to them in the budget, one from last year for seasonal mowing and one from this year for the same thing. Both payments were about $3,000. The line item on the statement Janice showed me was for $800, dated last month, and labeled as a compliance inspection fee. That fee was not in the budget. I opened the meeting minutes from June and found a paragraph about vendor renewals. The board had approved Green Edge for mowing only. No inspections, no compliance work, no individual property visits. I highlighted that section and saved it to a new folder on my desktop. Then I went back to my doorbell camera cloud and downloaded every clip from the past 3 weeks. I watched them at double speed, looking for anyone approaching my door with a notice. Nothing. No delivery, no Janice, no contractor. I checked my mail log and found no certified letters, no HOA envelopes, nothing about landscaping. I opened the group chat and scrolled back 6 months. 3 other people had posted about surprise violations in the past 2 months, and all of them mentioned not receiving the original notice. One of them, a guy named Brian, said he had asked Janice for proof of delivery, and she told him it was not her job to track mail. Another person, Lisa, said she paid a fine and then found out the rule she supposedly violated did not exist in the current covenants. I stared at the chat and realized the pattern. Every bogus violation in the past 6 months had one thing in common: Janice. She either delivered the notice herself or claimed it had been mailed, but nobody ever had proof. And every time someone pushed back, the enforcement got more aggressive. I remembered the old case people whispered about, the one with the missing money. I searched the group chat history for keywords like contractor, payment, and fraud. I found a thread from 3 years ago where someone named Carol had posted a question about duplicate vendor invoices. The thread had been deleted, but a few replies were still cached. One of them mentioned a board member resigning suddenly. Another mentioned a vote to hire a new management company. I took screenshots of everything and saved them to the same folder. Then I did something I should have done weeks ago. I filed a public records request with the HOA management company, asking for all vendor payments to Green Edge Property Services for the past 3 years, plus copies of all architectural violation notices issued to my address. I submitted it through the management company website, not the HOA portal, and I got an automated reply saying they would respond within 10 business days. I also sent an email to the board president, a quiet guy named Tom, who worked from home and rarely spoke at meetings. I explained the situation, attached the receipt Janice gave me, and asked if the compliance inspection fee was an approved charge. Tom replied within an hour. He said he had no record of any compliance fees being authorized, and he would look into it. He also said Janice had been submitting vendor invoices directly to the management company without board review, which was not supposed to happen. That was the first crack. I spent the rest of the night digging. I found a copy of the HOA bylaws on the county website and read the section on enforcement procedures. Any violation notice had to be sent via certified mail or hand-delivered with photographic proof of delivery. Verbal warnings were allowed, but they did not count as official notice. If a homeowner did not receive proper notice, the violation could not be enforced. I printed that section and highlighted it. Then I found the vendor contract approval process. Any payment over $500 required a board vote and inclusion in the monthly treasurer report. I searched the treasurer reports and found 2 payments to Green Edge that matched the budget, but nothing about compliance fees. I searched again and found a 3rd payment dated 2 months ago for exactly $800. It was not in the treasurer report. It was in the bank statement Janice had shoved in my face. Someone knocked on my door at 10 o'clock that night. I looked through the peephole and saw a guy in a reflective vest holding a tablet. He said he was with the tow company, and he needed to verify my vehicle. I opened the door and asked him what he meant. He said he had been dispatched to prep a tow for a compliance violation, but the work order did not have a vehicle description, so he needed to confirm which car. I asked him who called it in. He checked his tablet and said the order came from the HOA Architectural Committee. I told him there was no approved tow, and I had already paid the fine. He frowned and said the work order was issued 2 hours ago. I showed him the receipt Janice gave me. He took a picture of it with his phone and said he would call his dispatcher. He stepped off my porch and made the call. I stood in the doorway and listened. He told someone the homeowner had proof of payment and asked if they should cancel. I heard a woman's voice on the other end, faint but sharp. The driver sighed and said he was not going to tow a car without proper authorization. He hung up and told me the order was being reviewed. He apologized for the confusion and left. I closed the door and checked the group chat. Someone had already posted about seeing a tow truck in the neighborhood. 3 people replied asking whose car got towed. I did not respond. I went to my laptop and composed a second email to Tom. I told him what just happened, attached a photo of the tow driver's tablet screen showing the work order, and said this was the 2nd time in 12 hours that Janice had tried to escalate without following proper procedures. Tom replied at 11. He said he was calling an emergency board meeting for Friday and he wanted me to attend. He also said he was putting a freeze on all vendor authorizations until further notice. I thanked him and went to bed, but I did not sleep much. I kept replaying Janice's words. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." She had said that to me at the mailbox cluster, right before she took my cash. I realized she believed it. She thought she could enforce anything she wanted and nobody would push back hard enough to stop her. The next morning, I drove to the management office in South Burlington. It was in a strip mall next to a tax prep place, and the door was locked. A sign on the window said the office was open 9 to 11 on Tuesdays and Thursdays only, just like Janice had told me. I knocked anyway, and a woman opened the door. She said they were not open, and I needed to come back on Thursday. I told her I had a public records request pending, and I needed to speak to someone about fraudulent vendor charges. She hesitated, then let me in. Her name was Linda, and she was the property manager for 6 HOAs in the area. I explained the situation and showed her the receipt, the bank statement screenshot, and the vendor contract section from the bylaws. She pulled up my account on her computer and frowned. She said there were 3 violation notices on file for my address, all dated within the past 2 months and all marked as hand-delivered. I asked her if there was proof of delivery. She said no, but Janice had signed off on them. I asked her if Janice was authorized to sign off on deliveries without photo proof. Linda paused and said she would need to check the management agreement. Linda spent 20 minutes on the phone with the HOA's attorney while I sat in a folding chair and checked my watch. She hung up and told me the attorney wanted copies of everything I had. I handed her a thumb drive with all the documents, screenshots, and doorbell camera footage. She copied the files and said the attorney would review them and get back to Tom. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me this was not the first time someone had questioned Janice's enforcement methods. 3 years ago, a homeowner named Derek had filed a formal complaint about duplicate charges and missing notices. The board had investigated, but Janice claimed Derek had failed to respond to certified mail, and the post office had no record of the delivery. The case was closed as a clerical error, and Derek moved out shortly after. Linda said she always thought that outcome was strange, but she did not have the authority to reopen it. I asked her if she still had Derek's complaint on file. She said she would check. I left the management office and drove to the county clerk's office. I requested copies of all HOA filings for the reserve at Kingsbridge for the past 5 years. The clerk charged me $12 and printed a stack of documents. I sat in my car in the parking lot and flipped through them. Most of it was routine, annual reports, officer elections, covenant amendments. But buried in the middle was a resignation letter from a board member named Susan, dated 3 years ago. The letter was 1 sentence long. It said she was resigning effective immediately due to personal reasons. I took a picture of it and texted it to Tom. He replied 10 minutes later and said Susan had been the treasurer when Derek's case happened. He said he would try to reach her. I spent the rest of the day working from home, but I kept one eye on the group chat. Around 2 in the afternoon, someone posted a photo of Janice placing orange cones in front of a neighbor's driveway. The caption said she was marking spots for a landscaping crew to access a retention pond. 3 people commented asking why she did not send an email first. Janice replied in the chat and said the work was urgent and the board had approved it. Tom replied and said he had not approved anything. Janice did not respond. I screenshot the exchange and added it to my folder. At 4 in the afternoon, I heard a truck outside. I looked out the window and saw a flatbed tow truck backing into my driveway. I grabbed my phone and my keys and ran outside. The driver was lowering the bed and Janice was standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard and her handheld radio. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She said the payment I made yesterday had been rejected because I paid in cash and she needed a check. I told her that was not what she said yesterday. She said the policy had been clarified this morning. I asked her to show me the clarification in writing. She said it was verbal. I told the driver to stop. He looked at Janice, then at me, and said he needed to see a valid work order. I asked him if he had one. He checked his tablet and said the order was issued an hour ago by the architectural committee. I pulled up Tom's email on my phone and showed him the part where Tom said all vendor authorizations were frozen. The driver read it and sighed. He said he was not getting in the middle of this, and he needed someone from the board to confirm. He called his dispatcher, and Janice tried to take the phone from him. He stepped back and told her to wait. I stood there with my arms crossed, and 3 neighbors came out of their houses to watch. The driver hung up and told Janice the order was canceled. She demanded to know why, and he said his company was not going to risk a liability claim over a disputed payment. She told him she would report him to the board. He said he did not work for the board, he worked for the management company, and the management company had just told him to stand down. He raised the bed, got in his truck, and left. Janice turned to me and said I was making this harder than it needed to be. I told her she was the one who kept changing the rules. She said the rules were whatever the board approved, and I was not on the board. I asked her if Tom knew she had called a second tow. She did not answer. She walked away, and the neighbors went back inside. I stood in my driveway and checked my watch. The emergency board meeting was tomorrow at 6, and I had less than 24 hours to put together a case that would stick. I called Tom and told him what just happened. He said he was furious, and he had already sent Janice an email telling her to stop all enforcement actions until the meeting. He also said Linda had found Derek's old complaint file, and it included a photocopy of a check made out to Green Edge Property Services for $900. The check was dated 3 years ago, signed by Derek, and deposited 2 weeks after his complaint was closed. The problem was that Green Edge had never done any work at Derek's property. Tom said the attorney was reviewing the file now, and it looked like someone had pocketed the payment. I asked him if Janice had access to vendor checks. He said she did, because she handled architectural approvals and sometimes coordinated contractor access. I felt a chill. I asked him if Susan, the former treasurer, had resigned before or after Derek's check cleared. He checked his records and said it was 3 days after. I told him I thought we had our answer. Tom said he would bring the check copy to the meeting tomorrow. I thanked him and hung up. Then I did something that felt risky but necessary. I posted in the group chat and said I was attending the emergency board meeting tomorrow, and if anyone else had unresolved violations or missing notices, they should come too. Within an hour, 4 people replied saying they would be there. One of them was Brian, the guy who had posted about Janice refusing to provide proof of delivery. Another was Lisa, who said she had paid a fine for a rule that did not exist. A third person, named Mark, said he had been fighting a landscaping charge for 2 months and still had not received the original notice. I told them to bring any documentation they had. Brian said he had a recording of a conversation with Janice where she admitted the notice had been lost but insisted he still owed the fine. I asked him to bring that too. That night, I could not sleep again. I kept thinking about the phrase Janice had used. We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works. I pulled up the bylaws again and found the section on due process. It said homeowners had the right to a hearing before any punitive action, including fines, liens, or towing. Janice had skipped that step entirely. She had gone straight to enforcement, and she had done it multiple times. I drafted a 1-page summary of the violations, the missing notices, the unauthorized vendor payments, and the pattern of retaliation. I included timestamps, receipt copies, and a list of affected homeowners. I printed 5 copies and put them in a folder. Then I stared at the police incident report I had requested 2 weeks ago. It was from a night last year when a security patrol Janice had hired showed up at a neighbor's house at 2 in the morning, claiming they had authorization to inspect the backyard for code violations. The neighbor called the cops, and the officer on scene told the patrol to leave because they had no legal authority to enter private property. The incident number was still on file. I stared at the letter and smiled because it proved exactly what I suspected. Janice had a history of overstepping her authority, and someone in law enforcement had already documented it. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another neighborhood justice update. I printed a second copy of the incident report and put it in the folder. Then, I checked the weather. The forecast showed a storm rolling in tomorrow evening, right around the time the meeting was scheduled to start. I hoped it would hold off long enough for me to say my piece. I went to bed and set 3 alarms. Friday came fast. I woke up at 6, checked the group chat, and saw that Brian had posted a screenshot of an email from Linda. The email confirmed that the management company had frozen all enforcement actions pending the board's review, and any homeowner with an outstanding violation could request a formal hearing. Janice had not replied. I got dressed, grabbed my folder, and drove to work. The site audit went smoothly, and I was back home by 3. The meeting was at 6, and it was being held at the community clubhouse near the mailbox cluster. I arrived at 5:30 and found 8 people already there. Tom was setting up a folding table with a laptop and a projector. Brian and Lisa were sitting in the front row with their phones out. Mark was pacing near the door. A few other neighbors I did not recognize were scattered around the room. Janice was not there yet. Tom called the meeting to order at 6 sharp. He introduced himself and explained that the board had called this emergency session to address concerns about enforcement procedures and vendor payments. He said the attorney had advised the board to freeze all pending violations until a full audit could be completed. Janice walked in halfway through his sentence. She was wearing her black jacket, her gray baseball cap, and she had her handheld radio clipped to her belt. She sat in the back row and crossed her arms. Tom continued. He said the board had received multiple complaints about missing notices, unauthorized charges, and procedural violations. He asked if anyone wanted to speak. I raised my hand. I stood up and walked to the front. I handed Tom one copy of my summary and passed the rest to the people in the front row. Then, I explained everything. I told them about the bogus landscaping violation, the missing doorbell footage, the cash receipt with no letterhead, the 2 tow attempts, the portal failure, and the vendor payment that was not in the budget. I told them about Derek's case and the check that disappeared. I told them about the incident report from last year. I told them about the pattern. Janice interrupted me and said I was making false accusations. I ignored her and kept talking. I told the room that I had filed a public records request, and the management company had confirmed that 3 violation notices for my address had been logged without proof of delivery. I told them that the bylaws required certified mail or photographic proof, and Janice had provided neither. I told them that the compliance fee she charged me was not an approved line item, and it matched the amount of a phantom payment from 3 years ago. Janice stood up and shouted that I was a liar. She said she had delivered the notices personally, and if I did not remember, that was my problem. Brian stood up and said he had a recording. He played it on his phone. Janice's voice came through clearly, saying the notice had been mislaid, but the fine was still valid because the violation existed. Brian stopped the recording and asked her how a notice could be mislaid if she claimed she delivered it personally. Janice did not answer. Lisa stood up and said she had paid a fine for an unapproved porch light, and when she checked the covenants, there was no rule about porch lights. She asked Janice where the rule came from. Janice said it was a verbal policy. Tom interrupted and said there was no such thing as a verbal policy. He said all rules had to be in writing and approved by the board. Janice said she was enforcing community standards. Tom said that was not her job. Her job was to review architectural applications, not to create rules. Mark stood up and said he had been charged for a landscaping violation 3 months ago, and when he asked for the inspection report, Janice told him it was not available. He said he later found out Green Edge had never visited his property. He asked Janice how she could charge him for an inspection that never happened. Janice said the inspection had been completed, and if the contractor did not document it, that was not her fault. Tom asked her if she had a copy of the work order. She said no. He asked her if she had authorization from the board to hire Green Edge for individual inspections. She said she did not need authorization because it was part of the architectural review process. Tom said that was incorrect. He pulled up the vendor contract on the projector and showed the room the section that limited Green Edge to seasonal mowing only. He said any additional work required a board vote. Janice said the contract was outdated. Tom said it was renewed in January and had not been amended. Then, Tom did something I did not expect. He opened a spreadsheet on the projector and showed the room every payment to Green Edge for the past 3 years. There were 12 entries. 9 of them matched the approved budget. 3 of them did not. The 3 phantom payments were all labeled as compliance inspection fees, and they totaled $2,400. Tom said the board had never approved compliance inspection fees. He said the management company had confirmed that all 3 payments were authorized by Janice using a vendor approval form that bypassed the normal review process. He asked Janice if she had an explanation. She said the fees were legitimate, and if the board did not understand architectural enforcement, that was not her responsibility. Tom said the board understood enforcement just fine. He said what the board did not understand was why Janice had been collecting fees for inspections that never happened and depositing them into an account that was not listed in the HOA records. The room went silent. Janice said Tom was twisting the facts. Tom said he was reading the bank statements. He pulled up a second document on the projector. It was a photocopy of Derek's check made out to Green Edge Property Services for $900. Tom said the check had been deposited 3 years ago, 2 weeks after Derek's complaint was closed. He said Green Edge had no record of doing any work for Derek. He said the deposit was made into a personal account registered to Janice Mitchell. Janice stood up and said that was privileged information. Tom said it was public record because the attorney had subpoenaed the bank statements as part of the audit. Janice said the attorney had no right to do that. Tom said the attorney had every right when fraud was suspected. Janice's face went pale. She said she was leaving. Tom said if she left, the board would vote to remove her from the architectural committee and refer the matter to the State Consumer Protection Office. Janice said he could not do that. Tom said he could, and he had the votes. Brian stood up and said he would file a police report. Lisa said she would too. Mark said he wanted a refund. I stood up and said I had one more thing. I pulled the police incident report from my folder and held it up. I said this was from last year when Janice hired a security patrol to trespass on a neighbor's property without authorization. I said the officer on scene had documented the incident and told the patrol they had no legal authority. I said the incident number was still on file and it showed a pattern of Janice exceeding her authority and ignoring due process. I said I was bringing a second copy for the HOA attorney, so the legal risk was obvious. I handed one copy to Tom and one to Linda, who had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes. Janice tried to grab the papers from my hand. I stepped back and Tom told her to sit down. She did not. She said I was harassing her and she was going to call the police. I said that was fine because I had already requested an incident number from the officer who responded to my second tow attempt, and I would be happy to add tonight's meeting to the report. Janice froze. She looked at Tom, then at me, then at the door. She said this was a witch hunt. Tom said it was an audit. He said the board would be voting in 5 minutes on whether to remove Janice from all HOA leadership roles and refer the matter to the State Consumer Protection Office. He asked if anyone wanted to speak in her defense. Nobody did. He called for a vote. The motion passed 4-0. Janice was not allowed to vote because she was the subject of the motion. Janice stood there for a moment, her handheld radio clutched in one hand and her clipboard in the other. Then, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, looked at the screen, and her face went red. She tried to say something, but her phone died mid-sentence. The screen went black, and she froze in place, her mouth still open. Brian started laughing. Lisa covered her mouth. Mark shook his head. Janice shoved the dead phone into her jacket pocket, turned around, and walked out. The door slammed behind her, and the room erupted in chatter. Tom banged a gavel on the table and asked everyone to settle down. He said the board would be working with the attorney to finalize the audit and determine next steps. He said all pending violations would be dismissed pending a policy rewrite. He said the HOA would be refunding any fees paid for compliance inspections, and anyone who wanted to file a formal complaint could contact Linda for the paperwork. He said the meeting was adjourned. I walked outside and found a rideshare driver waiting in the parking lot, the same one who had rolled his eyes at the mailbox cluster days earlier. He looked at me and said he heard everything through the open window. He said Janice had tried to get him banned from the neighborhood last month because he parked too close to the curb. He said he was glad someone finally called her out. I thanked him and got in my car. The storm clouds were moving in fast, and the first drops of rain hit my windshield as I pulled out of the lot. I drove home and checked the group chat. Brian had posted a photo of the meeting sign-in sheet with no readable text, and someone had already commented asking if Janice was really gone. Tom replied and said the board would be issuing a formal statement within 48 hours. 2 days later, Linda sent me an email with a refund check for $200 and a letter confirming that all violations against my address had been dismissed. She said the State Consumer Protection Office had opened a case file, and the HOA's attorney was negotiating a settlement to avoid further legal action. She said Janice had resigned from all HOA leadership roles effective immediately, and the board was conducting interviews for a new architectural committee chair. She said Green Edge Property Services had been terminated, and the HOA was reviewing all vendor contracts for compliance. She also said Derek had been contacted, and he was considering filing a civil suit. I forwarded the email to Tom and thanked him for backing me up. He said I had done the hard part by refusing to let it go. A week later, I was at the hardware store picking up some screws when I saw Janice in the parking lot. She was standing next to her car, talking on her phone and waving her clipboard like she was still in charge of something. I walked past her, and she stopped mid-sentence. She stared at me, and I could see the anger in her eyes. She lowered the phone and said, "I will make an example out of you so everyone learns." I stopped and turned around. I told her she already tried that, and it did not work out the way she planned. She said I had no idea what I had done. I said I knew exactly what I had done. I had reopened a cold case she thought was buried. I had connected the clues she thought nobody would find, and I had caught her red-handed. I said the State Consumer Protection Office had her bank statements, the attorney had the police incident report, and the board had the audit trail. I said she could keep waving that clipboard all she wanted, but it did not mean anything anymore. A police cruiser pulled into the lot and a detective got out. He walked over to us and asked if we were Janice Mitchell and the homeowner who filed the incident report. I said yes. He said he was following up on the complaint and he needed to ask Janice a few questions. She said she did not have to answer anything. He said that was her right, but he was investigating allegations of fraud and trespass, and if she refused to cooperate, he would include that in his report. She asked him if I had put him up to this. He said no. The State Consumer Protection Office had referred the case to his department after reviewing the HOA audit. He said they had found evidence of unauthorized vendor payments, forged compliance notices, and a pattern of harassment. He asked her if she had anything to say. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. He handed her a business card and told her to contact him within 48 hours if she wanted to provide a statement. Then he turned to me and said I had done a good job documenting everything. He said cases like this usually fell apart because people did not keep records. I thanked him, and he left. Janice stood there holding the business card, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her face pale. She looked at me one more time and said, "You ruined everything." I told her she ruined it herself when she decided to pocket fees and forge notices. I said I just made sure everyone found out. She got in her car and drove away, and I watched her taillights disappear into the storm clouds. I went inside the hardware store, bought my screws, and went home. The group chat was blowing up with updates. Tom had posted the board's formal statement. It said Janice had been removed from all HOA leadership roles. The HOA was cooperating with the state investigation, and the board was implementing new transparency policies to prevent future abuses. It said all homeowners with pending violations would receive written dismissals, and anyone who had paid compliance fees would be refunded within 30 days. It said the board apologized for the harm caused and thanked those who came forward. Brian replied and said he was getting his refund check in the mail. Lisa said she was drafting a letter to the State Consumer Protection Office asking them to pursue criminal charges. Mark said he was moving out anyway, but he was glad Janice was gone. I did not post anything. I just sat on my couch and stared at the ceiling, feeling like I could finally breathe. The cold case was closed. The ghost vendor scam was exposed. The receipts had spoken. And the woman who thought she could enforce whatever she wanted had learned that even HOAs have rules, and even board members can be held accountable. 3 months later, the State Consumer Protection Office announced that the HOA had settled the case. The settlement included full refunds for all unauthorized fees, a policy rewrite to strengthen oversight, and a requirement that all vendor payments be reviewed by the full board before processing. Janice was barred from serving in any HOA leadership role in the state for 10 years. The detective told me she had also been charged with theft by deception, and her case was pending. I never saw her in the neighborhood again. The new architectural committee chair was a retired engineer named Paul who sent email notifications for everything and posted meeting minutes within 24 hours. The reserve at Kingsbridge HOA became the most transparent board in Burlington, and people started moving in instead of moving out. I still check my doorbell camera every morning, and I still keep a folder of receipts on my desktop, but I do not worry about surprise TOWs anymore. And every time I walk past the mailbox cluster, I think about that night when Janice slapped a bank statement on the table and screamed that the totals were correct because she said so. She was wrong. The totals were never correct. And in the end, a city inspector confirming what the HOA cannot enforce, Karen's bluff getting read out loud and the room reacting, the HOA freezing enforcement pending a policy rewrite, and Karen's phone dying mid-rant while she froze in place, all added up to one simple truth. Receipts do not lie. And they're due public records. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.